The purpose of this video is to show you how to use MLA style of documentation. Now, there's a few terms you're going to have to be familiar with. One of those is MLA and the other is outside sources. I'll walk you through each of those and then we'll get started. MLA stands for Modern Language Association. It's a way to document your outside sources in a consistent way. Chances are you're probably in an English class, perhaps, and that's why your teacher has asked for MLA. In some of your other classes, you might be asked to use a different style of documentation. Really, if you learn one, it's fairly easy to shift among the others. Others include the APA, or the American Psychological Association style of documentation. There's the Chicago Manual style, as well as the APSA. Outside sources is another term you're going to need to be familiar with. Teachers kind of differ on what they mean by outside sources, but primarily what it means is an outside source is something that you're putting into your paper that didn't come from your own brain. So this can be broken down into two main types of outside sources. One is called the primary. Say, for example, your instructor has assigned A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and you're using a quote from that book. The quote from that book would be a primary source. It comes directly from the book that you're writing about. Another type of outside source is what's called secondary source. And this might be an essay, for example, written about A Tale of Two Cities by someone else. And by an essay, I mean like in a journal, not like one of your peers. So in this case, this isn't actually a book of A Tale of Two Cities. What's depicted here is a collection of essays about A Tale of Two Cities. Now, whether they're primary or secondary sources, ultimately, they're both considered outside sources. Now the question might come up, well, why do I have to do this? And that's a fair question given the amount of work it seems to take. Trust me though, that when you get the hang of it, it comes easier and easier with each successive essay. The main reason we do it is to acknowledge to our instructor and perhaps to ourselves and anyone else reading it what doesn't come from us, what ideas we got from elsewhere. And it's important to do that in a very specific way so that we're consistent, not just from paper to paper, but within a given discipline, as well as among all our peers. It makes the instructor's job a lot easier as well, which you may or may not care about, but it's going to make your job easier as time goes on because there'll be less thinking involved when it comes to how to document the stuff, and you can focus all your thinking then on expressing ideas in your essay. The other thing that helps is we avoid plagiarism, and that's exceptionally important in college. Plagiarism is to be avoided at all costs. It's academic cheating, and it's not tolerated. Now that we know the basics of MLA, the easiest way to approach this is to realize that there are two main components whenever you document an outside source using MLA. The first is what's called an in-text citation, and I'll detail these in just a moment. But very basically, an in-text citation is usually a quotation or a paraphrase that's within your actual essay. So say in one of your body paragraphs you're proving a point and you get a quote to help you back up that point, well, that's called an in-text citation. The next part is a works cited page, which comes at the end of your essay. It's a separate page at the end of your essay titled a works cited page, and on that is a list of all the sources that you've used in your in-text citations. I'll break these down. In-text citations. If you notice, what I've done here is over here in the left-hand column. Here you can see in-text citation, and I put that on all the slides that indicate that I'm still talking about in-text citation. That'll change to works cited when I get to the works cited portion of this video. Personally, I like to give my students a visual on how to think about the in-text citations because it's fairly involved and doing it well takes a little bit of practice. I like to introduce the quote sandwich. This isn't something I invented. I don't know who did, but it worked for me as a visual. As you can see, there's three components to every in-text citation. The top piece of bread is called the introductory material. The heart of the sandwich there is called the quote or the paraphrase. And then following that is the commentary after the quote. And one thing I'd like to point out right here is that usually the first two parts of this in-text citation are combined into one sentence. Not always, but usually. And I'll give you some examples of this in just a moment. So introductory material and quotation, this is the top 2/3 of that sandwich. And there's a little visual, the arrows are pointing to introductory material and the quote or paraphrase. So this is that part. When you introduce the quote, you want to do so with your own words. It's called introductory material. There's a few different ways of doing this as well. Some things you also want to keep in mind when you have this introductory material and the quotation is you want the author's name in there somewhere if it's known, and a page number if available. And these should go in very specific places. So here's an example of a direct quote. We have a quotation mark at the beginning, and then it says, "Dance is the ultimate art form because it blends style and grace into one fluid movement," end quote. And it has a number in parentheses. Now those parentheses, it's called a parenthetical citation, which just really means parentheses at the end. And that indicates that that came from a page 33. Now this is a good start. Unfortunately, this does not complete everything necessary. There is no introductory material. This is just a quote. Consequently, this really isn't good. We want to make the introductory material flow smoothly into our quote. Here's a different example. I'll give you a moment to read it. If you notice, the quotation marks still cover the same material. The parenthetical citation still has the same page number, but what's different is this part in the beginning right here. Dance expert Peppard notes, comma. Two things I want to point out. There's no fragment here, there's no run-on here. That dependent clause blends smoothly with the independent clause that follows, and it also introduces the author, which is one of the requirements for this introductory / quotation part of the quote sandwich. So this is done well. There's two ways of doing this as well. Here, in this example, Peppard, the author's name, is given in the introductory material. In the next example, however, you'll see that Peppard has actually moved down into the parenthetical citation. The reason for that is because up here now, in the introductory material, the author's name isn't mentioned. Instead, it's a vague, "a known dance expert suggests." This is perfectly acceptable as well, as long as I have that author's name and the page number where they belong, which is anywhere in this construct. Then I've done this correctly. What follows is an example of a paraphrase. Now, a paraphrase is putting the entire quote into your own words and syntax. And that's really key. You don't want to take the same syntax or the same sentence style or anything else. So you just want to phrase it as best you can in your own words. And even when I do that, the thing you're going to notice right now is that there are no longer any quotation marks, but I still have the author's name and the pagination identified in the parenthetical citation. And that's really important. Again, I could have put Peppard up here. I could have said Peppard, comma, a known dance expert, comma, suggests the fluidity and grace of dance makes it a form of art. That would have been equally acceptable. And that's how we do a paraphrase. When we introduce quotes with our words, that introductory part is often called a signal phrase. There are some signal phrases that get overused, and unfortunately, they're the easier ones to do, and we kind of fall into the trap of going back and forth to those go-to signal phrases. An example is according to. Once in a while this is fine, but if you have an essay filled with according to, it gets old pretty quickly. And there are other ways of doing it. Here is a list. You can pause the video whenever you like and come back to this list. Here's a list of verbs that are useful for the signal phrase. I could say, Peppard emphasizes, or so-and-so proposes. All of these are good words to use, and to mix them up makes your essay seem to have variety, and that's always something that's to be This sums up the first 2/3 of that quote sandwich, the introductory material and the quotation or paraphrase. From here, we move into the commentary. The commentary, to give you the visual once again, is that last piece of bread, the bottom piece of bread on that quote sandwich. We can't just throw a quote into the paper, because that forces the reader to figure out what to do with it or how to make sense of it. Really, that's the writer's job. to demonstrate why that particular quote or what function it's serving within the paragraph and the grade or essay. And that's ultimately what the commentary does. It indicates why this quote or paraphrase is in the essay. There's some things to avoid when you're doing commentary, and again, it's the most natural thing to fall into, and it gets old pretty quickly, which is why we try to avoid it. One of those is to say, this quote shows. It's not really a good way to do this. I'm going to show you a couple examples of better ways of doing it than this quote shows. Another thing to avoid is, as can be seen from this quote, we never have to emphasize this quote, or the quote that I just showed you shows this. Lastly, we never want to say this shows. I always ask my students, what does this mean? Now you've left it up to the reader to go back and figure out whatever this refers to. It's an empty word at this point. Here's an example of one of those things you should avoid. Pause the video and go ahead and read it, but I'm moving on. The first part here is the introductory material with the quotation. Now, in this case, the quotation is really, really short. It's only established in 1895, and the introductory material is much longer. That's not really the emphasis of this particular example, however. Instead, I want to move on to the second part, which says, this shows the viewing audience that Cheers is a safe haven. This is the part that I have issue with, the part that says, this shows, right here. That's what should be avoided. What shows? See, the reader now has to go back and figure out, oh, the fact that it's an old bar established in 1895 shows that Cheers is a safe haven. There's a better way of doing it than this. And here's the better example. Again, pause the video. Here, the first part is still the same and unchanged. However, I've gotten rid of this shows, and instead I've re-emphasized what I've already established. Such emphasis on the date of establishment confirms Cheers is a safe haven. This is a much better way of doing commentary in your essays, and it's the preferred method. It may seem a slightly bit repetitive, but it's better to be a little repetitive in this sense than to use those standard this shows that really are kind of empty. From here we move on to the works cited, and you'll notice down here that things have changed to works cited. This is a complicated part of the essay. The good news is, once you get the hang of it, life becomes a whole lot easier, and there's even a couple online sources that are really, really useful. Actually, Microsoft Word actually has a pretty decent program built in now that can save you a lot of time, both on your in-text citations and your works cited page. I don't have time to get into that right now, but if ever you want to, go to the Help button on Microsoft Word, type in MLA Citation, and it's got a built-in little machine. First, let's talk about the basics of what a works cited page is. Note, it does not start halfway through your last page or anything else. It's a separate page. We actually waste that piece of paper to start a works cited page at the end of your essay. The title is works cited. It'd be works cited if you only have one outside source, works cited if you have more. The quotation marks that are right here, they go away on your works cited page. There are no quotation marks on the title of your works cited page, just like the title of your essay does not get quotation marks. The entries that you put on the works cited page are in alphabetical order. In addition, they have a funky look to them called a hanging indent, and I'll indicate that in just a moment. The works cited page, like your essay, is double spaced throughout as well. So let's take a look at a sample works cited page, and I can emphasize some of these things. First of all, there's the title, works cited. Your last name goes up here and the pagination continues with the rest of your essay. Notice alphabetical order, A, C, C. This is what I mean by hanging indent right here. The beginning of the entry starts over here, and if it spills onto a second, third, or fourth line, all that gets indented. And then we start the next entry back in line with the first one, hang the indent all the way down. This is an example of a works cited entry. There is a problem with this one. It's not double spaced. It should be double spaced. But it is a hanging indent. We see that right here. It starts out with the author's last name, and all the information that spills onto additional lines gets that hanging indent. This part of the video is where I run the risk of just giving you way too many details, but I'm going to try to keep this pretty simple. All works cited entries start out with the author of the smaller item first. So if you have, say, an article in a larger essay, the person who wrote the article's name goes here, and then the title of the essay, or the article right here. And that goes in quotation marks. And then the bigger item comes along. This might be a book, for example, or in this case it might be a magazine or a periodical, American Women's Autobiography, Feasts of Memory. And the larger item had an editor, Margot Cully. Then comes the city of publication. If the city isn't well known, say like New York or Los Angeles, and people might not know where Madison is, then you put a further identifier, in this case, Wisconsin. And then comes the name of the publisher. In this case, it was University of Wisconsin Press. Then comes the date of publication. And in this case, since it is a journal, we do get the page numbers here. The article was between pages 302 and 314. Ideally too, there's something missing here. This should either say print for a print source or web if I found this information on the internet. I'm only going to show you a few more examples, the very basics. Here we have a book with one author. In this case, the author's name comes first. Sharp last name, comma, first name, period. Then the title of the book, which is italicized, The True Memoirs of Little K. The city of publication, New York, colon, all this punctuation matters. The publisher's name, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, I have no idea how to pronounce that, comma, date of publication 2010, period, and then the identifier, whether it was a print source or a web source. In this case, it was a print source. I have another example for you. Here is a book with two authors. The author's name, last name first, Bachman, comma, Susan, and then something interesting happens with two authors, comma, and then we have first name, last name. And if there are three authors, I might have a comma, and then the author's first name, last name. Name of the book italicized, Between Worlds, A Reader Rhetoric and Handbook, period. City of publication, New York, colon, the publisher, Longman, the date of publication, and then what kind of source it was, print or web. If you notice, they all follow the same pattern. And that's the pattern that you want to be consistent with. Now, I'm going to give you two sources, or actually I'm going to give you one source. One is the Purdue OWL site, and all you have to do is go to Google and type in OWL and then MLA, and it'll take you there. And it'll give you examples of pretty much anything you want to do. You want to quote a YouTube video? There's an example of how to do that. You want to quote a movie, a CD, whatever it is, there's probably an example there. And rather than me go through each and every one of the examples, now that you have the basics of how to write or how to use MLA, I invite you to go there, find specific information that you need, and I wish you the best of luck with your essays.